Thanks everyone for joining. I'm sure you're already quite tired because it's one of the last sessions, but let's try to make it as interesting as possible. I will be talking about AIOps and how organizations today tend to enable AIOps through observability, SRE, and other best practices. My name is Michele Dodic, based in Munich, Germany. I work for Accenture. I'm a SRE solution architect, focusing on observability, chaos engineering, and obviously mainly SRE. I would say that in the past years, I've been mainly focusing on helping our big enterprises to adopt observability and adopt AIOps in an efficient manner. So I think the presentation today will be rather a kind of summary of all the best practices, the pros and the cons, let's say, in terms of what to do and what not to do when embarking on such a journey. The agenda is quite straightforward. So I prepared a short comic that shows you a bit of the pitfalls in terms of what organizations trying to do today to achieve AIOps and what you should be careful about. And then also get our hands dirty with a demo where I'll show you how a zero-touch AIOps platform looks like. Okay, let's quickly set the scene. So let's look at today's key challenges in SRE and modern IT. So what's happening is that we are talking about complex, dynamic, hybrid multi-cloud architectures that are changing and growing with time. And these are often coupled also with some legacy platforms like mainframe, SAP. And you can already imagine what is the struggle of getting the data from all these different dynamic sources, heterogeneous sources, and making some sense out of it, right? What we often see across big enterprises that are dealing currently with these problems is the problem of information silos. So maybe they do have some monitoring tools that are monitoring specific instances and specific areas, but the data that they're collecting is not really correlated. They're not able to produce actionable insights, so to say. What we also often see is tools sprawl. So that means that, as I said, they get different monitoring tools, different monitoring and observability platforms. But again, if you don't have a centralized intelligence layer where you correlate all your data and build meaningful topologies, you simply won't get the insight out of it, and you simply won't get the value out of it. And this is specifically a huge challenge for SREs today because it is the job of the SRE to keep all these different platforms and services with high availability. Another important point to mention is that we are also talking about shift left. So it's not just about maintaining high service availability in production, but making sure that in development, we are also satisfying some SLOs and other practices. Okay, so imagine that we have a big enterprise, we have the CTO, the PO management, whoever you want, and they notice that they are getting bad feedbacks for their platform. So what do I need to do? The CTO needs to speak to the operations team. So it's obviously a disaster. And maybe this was applicable 4 or 5 years ago, so before the boom of AI. So when issues would happen in operations, we would see enterprises saying, okay, let's do automation. Automate everything possible and it will solve all our problems. So the operation teams implement the different automation steps to restore the faulty service. The tech lead implements all of that. However, what happens is it's still a problem. So it seems that even after every restart, the service works briefly and fails again. So even after implementing automation. So before I proceed, what is your gut feeling like why this didn't work? Exactly. So just plugging in automation doesn't solve the issue. You need to find the root cause. And in order to find the root cause, you need to have a sound observability strategy and you need to have enabled contextualized observability. Because if you have a black box approach, it will simply not give you any value because you don't see what's happening in your system. The CTO, the management comes pissed and says, okay, this is not working. I see everyone is implementing AI. Everyone is implementing Gen AI. Guys, implement AI and Gen AI. So the team goes, they implement all the features that plug in AI and say, okay, let's see if we get some insights now. They do get some insights. However, it's meaningless. If you look at all these alerts, it's exactly what I was talking about before, information silos. You get monitors, you get alerts from all different systems, all different heterogeneous components, but you don't have a single source of truth. You don't have the root cause, right? So this is, again, not helping. So we have applied automation, AI, Gen AI, and it did not work. And this is one of the pitfalls that we see today across big enterprises. They want to reach AIOps, they want to reach zero touch, but they always forget to set up first a sound observability strategy. The CTO comes back and says, okay, this is not working anymore. We need to do something about it. Let's hire an SRE. And you better listen what he or she says. So the SRE says, okay, automation and AI is actually meaningless until you first enable observability, which means moving away from the black box approach, collecting logs, metrics, traces. And once we have this data, we need to make some sense out of it, right? So once we ingest all this data, we need to build something that we call context-aware topologies. So we need to be able to understand what is the topologies and what is the dependency between the different services. Talking about both infrastructure and application. Why is this important? Because we are trying to move, as we will later see, we're trying to move away from reactive monitoring. We're trying to move away from the what is that it's not working, but we rather want to understand what is the why. Because once we understand what is the why, we'll be able to prevent it in the future. As the SRE says, now that we are able to understand what is the root cause, we can apply AI in order to understand when an issue is occurring before it actually occurs. So this is the predictive, let's say, domain. And the final, let's say, ingredient is automation. So automation comes as a latest step, meaning that once you have contextualized observability, AI that is able to predict future service degradation, future failures based on baselines, data, patterns, only then can you apply automation in the end to trigger some self-remediated workflows. So, is the story here to its end? So does the story end here? Not really, because we're talking about infra, we're talking about application, but we have forgotten a very important aspect here, which is business. So imagine now business comes in and says, okay, we're having some issue in production. I'm not seeing the impact on my KPIs. I see all your fancy techie dashboards, but that means nothing to me. So what is the business impact? And this is another super important point for today, is when you are enabling observability, you need to connect and you need to find a bridge between operations and business from the very early stages. Because then business can also give you some insights in terms of which KPIs you want to measure, and it gives also them the value in terms of what you are doing. So business and operation need to be connected since the early stages. And this is the topic of end-to-end monitoring. So when an issue occurs on an infrastructure side, we need to be able to understand directly what the impact is on the application, what is the health of my service, but I also need to understand what is the direct impact on my business KPIs. So this kind of, let's say, comic was showing, let's say, the pitfalls of achieving zero-touch AIOps. This is our sort of Accenture's journey to zero-touch AIOps, from reactive monitoring to autonomous and federated systems. And these we built based on our lessons learned and, let's say, best practices that we've seen working at our customers. I'll just quickly go through the different stages, even though the comic was already giving hints in terms of what are the steps to be taken, right? So reactive monitoring, I don't think I need to explain this in detail. I think it's clear for everyone. An issue occurs, you see something on a dashboard, you create a new ticket, you assign the incident to someone, then someone needs to fix it. You can imagine the amount of time it takes to actually find the issue and fix it is too long, and it could propagate to other services. So it could create even greater failure than it actually was originally. This is why we need to move from black box to internalization of our system via observability, metrics, logs, traces, which I mentioned earlier. We then need to use this data and contextualize it. I'll show you later when we'll be talking about topology-based correlation and context-aware topology. So this is about using causal AI to understand what is the dependency between the services, so that when an issue occurs, a failure occurs on a specific service, we know what are the systems and what is the root cause. Only then can we apply different versions of AI and machine learning to understand, based on historical data and baselines, when the issue will occur before it actually happens. Think about Black Friday, think about Cyber Monday. And only then finally the last magic ingredient is automation. So only once we have trained our models and we're sure that this is sound, we implement automation. So the final point is to have a trigger that triggers some kind of self-remediation or self-healing. And this is why we call these use cases zero touch, because you don't need any intervention from a human being, right? What's also important to mention is that throughout, let's say, from reactive monitoring, you can gather IT insights. So talking about infra, talking about services. But only once you start adopting and enabling observability, will you be able to also gather business insights. Important to mention that this here is not a one-size-fits-all kind of model, right? So you could have also more critical services, which are, let's say, obviously more critical, and you require a higher level of maturity. But maybe for some other ones, you don't really want to have the highest level of automation, right? You need to understand where you are right now, where your services are, and what are the priorities for you. This is another diagram, just, I think, completing a bit the picture. When we're talking about end-to-end monitoring, we're talking about infrastructure monitoring, so the vertical stack, application monitoring, horizontal stack. So think about a chain of services calling each other, and when an issue occurs, you're then able to pinpoint which service is the faulty one, and then you go down the vertical stack to understand what is the infrastructure component that failed. Once you have that, you achieve end-to-end monitoring, and on top of that, you can then plug in business data. Before I jump into the demo, I just want to mention and clear out a couple of key concepts. What we are seeing right now in the space of observability, a lot of strategic, bigger observability platforms are using a version, something that we call multimodal AI, which is a combination of causal, generative, and predictive AI. So let's look at this diagram here, at this example here, to explain a bit better, right? So we have our observability platform, which is monitoring our end-to-end environment. And then we have a potential issue detected. So this is an issue that might happen in the future, and therefore here we are talking about predictive AI. What we can do then is use this data to generate a kind of report, right? For the incident manager or for whomever. And here we can use, obviously, the causal AI to understand what is the root cause. And finally, to generate the report, we use generative AI. So in the end, what we have is, number one, we understand what the root cause is so that we know what to fix. We generate a pre-mortem report for the incident manager. So this is via generative AI. And finally, we can visualize this maybe in our dashboard that we are using. So the combination of these three types of AI can help us reach zero touch. And we will see this now in an actual demo. This is a diagram showing what I'll be presenting now at the demo, just to give a bit more clarity. So what I will do is I will use a chaos experiment. We had already a speaker who talked a lot about chaos engineering, so it's a great intro, so I don't have to go into the details. However, what I will do, I will deploy an application. I will try to break it on purpose, and then I will show how through AI and other best practices, we can solve this issue automatically and have all the reportings on all the relevant dashboards. For this demo, I will be using Kubernetes, Dynatrace, ServiceNow. But again, these platforms are just exemplary. You can implement this also with Splunk, Datadog, and other kind of platforms that are there on the market right now. Let me just check that stuff is running in the background. Great. This is the GitHub repo of my demo application. So this is a banking application based on a Kubernetes microservices architecture. And again, this is a banking example with Kubernetes, but I ask you to keep your minds open because this is just one of dozens of examples that you can achieve. So it doesn't have to be Kubernetes, it doesn't have to be Dynatrace, it doesn't have to be the banking domain. So the focus here is more on the best practices for zero-touch AIOps. So what I will do is I will basically be killing this account service, which is obviously a critical service for authentication. and it's communicating with the broker service and an Nginx proxy. So I already expected that I will see some kind of impact also on the other services. This is my application. This is an experiment that I ran yesterday. So before I ran the experiment, everything was running fine. I can log in, log out without any issues. So on Dynatrace, I have ingested this Kubernetes data via one agent, and these are the topologies that I was talking about. So these are the different services here that we can see and their correlation, right? So we can also look into processes, we can look into hosts, but right now for this demo, what's interesting is the service health. So what I will be doing is I'll be breaking this connection between the Nginx and the account service. Before I proceed really quickly, I think it's important to mention, before I ran the chaos experiment, this is my deployment on my Azure Kubernetes cluster of the EasyTrade banking application. And what's important to mention is that right now we only have, in this point in time, one account service, which, as you will see, I will be soon breaking. So I'm using Litmus Chaos. This is an open source chaos engineering platforms, and I will be running a very simple experiment. I will basically be killing the account service pod. So I will be running a pod delete. So I will be running here a pod delete, and my target will basically be the account service. So if I look at here, the target is account service in the deployment banking. After I run this experiment, before running this experiment, obviously, SRE 101, let's set up some SLOs. So I'm using the failure rate of the Nginx as an indicator for me. Once I run the experiment, I see that I cannot anymore log into the page. So users cannot log into the banking application. And I can see already that so I triggered the experiment at 1:30 p.m. So we already see an increased failure rate, right? And now let's go back quickly to the end-to-end dashboarding topic. So we have business, right? And maybe if I didn't set up this SLO, I won't see the impact directly. So maybe on infrastructure and application side, for whichever reason, I don't have the right observability tools to understand that there's an issue. However, if I look at the business dashboard, I can see already, without looking at applications and infrastructure, I can already see that there is a drop in different KPIs, banking KPIs, especially here the trade volume. After 3:30 p.m., it basically starts dropping, right? And what I have also implemented is a custom Gen AI advisor, as I call it here, the SRE advisor, that gives me basically a explanation in a natural language what's going on. A decline in trading activity has been observed within So it basically explains in natural words what's actually going on, especially for non-technical people, right? And also gives us some kind of post-mortem suggestions in terms of what we should do in the future to prevent it. If I go to the service dashboard, I can see directly which services are affected. Account service, obviously, because the availability is down, and other services are affected because they're not getting any response from account service. So I see that some of my SLOs are affected. The same is here explained by the SRE advisor. And this is the infrastructure side. So I have 20 pods, one problematic pod, and the SRE advisor is telling me, hey, EasyTrade is in a terminating state. So if I go down here, I will see that account service is actually in a terminating state. And this is my root cause. But now, this was a small digression on end-to-end monitoring, stressing that it's really important to cover infra, application, business. However, now let's take another step back and let's imagine that we don't have these dashboards. But however, we have a mechanism in place to catch these issues and trigger some self-remediation. So what we have here is workflows. So what I am doing is I'm saying every time the platform creates a problem, because basically we will see later Dynatrace automatically creates problems based on these topologies here and based on these metrics. And this is basically AI out of the box. Every time it creates a problem in the banking namespace with this specific description, trigger a workflow. So the first thing I want to do is I want to notify my SRE team that something is going wrong, that something is happening in the background. So I automatically create a ServiceNow incident, And I can put here different kinds of information. You could put here also information from the SRE advisor with all the business impacts. However, what's interesting here is that if I take this URL, it takes me directly to the problem which was created by the observability platform. And imagine in traditional monitoring perspective, right? When you have a critical issue, you need to organize a post-mortem, firefight, and basically have these war rooms when all the lead developers and infrastructure leads come in and start finger pointing, saying, no, it's a problem with the middleware. The other says, no, it's a problem with network. But you can imagine the cost that you can save by basically having all these root cause analysis and data in a matter of seconds. And it tells me how many users were affected, how many service calls were affected. And I here have the visual resolution path. So basically I can replay the problem evolution to understand what happened at what time and caused failure for which components. But again, this was the ServiceNow part. In the background, what I do, I also trigger, I send an API trigger to my Flask app, which is running in the background, and basically does some auto-scaling, right? With GitHub Runner, I trigger basically my Flask app that we can see here, remediation workflow triggered, and it applies a couple of scripts. And these scripts, what they do, they create basically a replica. So if you remember in the beginning, we had one account service, and at the end of this flow, we have 3 additional replicas, meaning that even if my chaos experiment is attacking one of my account services, I have 3 other replicas that make my solution more robust. So after the self-remediation, if I go to my service, I can see that the failure rate has basically decreased and gone to 0. So this was solved automatically. Yes, we had a period from 1335 to approximately 40, so around 4 or 5 minutes of issues where users couldn't log in, but we have instrumented our entire systems in order to be able to understand when the failure occurs, what's the root cause, and what needs to be fixed automatically. Once that is done, once the SLOs are restored, we can close the incident in ServiceNow. And once I go back to my dashboards, I see that everything is green. The SRE advisor has no updates for me, and the problem has been solved, right? Yes, we had this outage here, 5 minutes, where people couldn't log in, but afterwards, even the business KPIs have been normalized and brought to a healthy state. Good. I suggest that we wrap things up. Lessons learned for today. We have shown how zero-touch AIOps evolved from reactive monitoring via observability and by leveraging multimodal AI, so the 3 types we talked about, we can reach this kind of next-gen AIOps stage. But as I said, always depends on your priorities and the criticality. So always first do an assessment of your end-to-end system and try to understand where you want to focus. What is also important to mention and not forget, align business priorities since the early stages. The earlier you start doing this, the better time you have later. And finally, put your AIOps solutions to the test. Once you have set this up, make sure you test it. And what's better to test than the chaos experiment like we've seen in the live demo.